The ice sheets of Antarctica do not freeze time, they preserve secrets. We look at the southern continent as a vast, white desert of pure, unblemished snow, a sterile wasteland where nothing can survive without life support systems. We believe the ice is nothing more than frozen water, accumulating layer by layer over millions of years to form a solid, predictable shield over the bedrock. But ice is a fluid medium, moving under immense pressure, flowing like a slow-motion river over valleys that have been cut off from the atmosphere since the dawn of humanity. And if you drill deep enough into the heart of a subglacial trench, using pressurized thermal bits to melt your way through 2 miles of solid ice, you eventually puncture the seal on an ecosystem that operates on an entirely alien set of physical laws. My name is Eric, and for 10 years, I worked as a senior cryostratigraphy technician for the International Cryogenic Research Initiative. My specialization was ice core telemetry analysis. My job was located at Station Boreas, a highly classified research outpost constructed inside a natural subglacial cavern 2 miles beneath the surface of the West Antarctic Ice Sheet. The station was accessible only by a vertical utility shaft equipped with a heavy industrial hoist system. Our team consisted of 12 scientists, engineers, and drill operators, tasked with using a high-pressure thermal drilling assembly to extract ice cores from the deepest, oldest layers of the Bentley subglacial trench, a massive canyon buried so far beneath the ice that the atmospheric pressure alone would crush a human being if the cavern weren't artificially pressurized. Living inside an underground ice station at the bottom of a 2-mile shaft is an exercise in psychological endurance. The world is reduced to a uniform, blinding shade of industrial white and steel gray. The only sound is the constant, deafening roar of the thermal boilers heating the drilling fluid, mixed with the high-pitched, metallic shriek of the cables holding the core barrels as they are hoisted up from the depths. But if you walk away from the living modules and stand at the edge of the active drilling platform, looking down into the vertical borehole, the industrial noise is swallowed by a freezing, heavy void. The ice at that depth doesn't look white. Under the high-intensity halogen floodlights, it is a dense, translucent, and glossy shade of obsidian blue, so dark and deep that it looks like you are staring into the vacuum of space through a frozen window. It was during a fierce blizzard on the surface in late June when the thermal bit broke through the bottom of the ice sheet. The time was exactly 2:42 in the morning. I was sitting at my triple-monitor workstation inside the telemetry shack, tracking the real-time density and temperature data coming from the downhole sensor array. The drill bit had reached a depth of 14,000 feet, navigating a layer of ice that had been compressed by the weight of the continent for over 15 million years. Suddenly, the primary data streams on my central monitor collapsed. The steady, geometric graphs representing bit torque, fluid back pressure, and core density instantly dropped to absolute zero. The change wasn't a gradual deceleration, and it wasn't a standard mechanical failure like a frozen pump line or a sheared drill head. The downhole sensors indicated that the massive thermal drill bit had dropped out of the solid ice sheet into a complete physical vacuum. 1 second, the bit was melting its way through ultra-dense, high-pressure ice at 12,000 pounds of resistance per square inch, and the next second, it was suspended in an empty space that offered absolutely zero physical resistance. I initiated a manual diagnostic override, attempting to force a reboot of the downhole telemetry package to verify if the sensors had simply failed due to the extreme sub-zero temperatures. As the system initialized, the acoustic sensors located just above the core barrel began to relay a live data stream to my headphones. The deep core drilling process normally produces a chaotic, high-pitched screech through the audio channels, the sound of pressurized steam and boiling water cutting through frozen rock. But the speakers didn't produce a screech. They returned a deep, rhythmic, and hollow roar that sounded exactly like the wind howling through an infinite, empty cavern. I increased the output volume on my mixing desk to its maximum setting. Out of the deep acoustic vacuum of the borehole, a vocal signal began to materialize. It wasn't a human voice shouting for help, and it wasn't a radio transmission from another research station. It was a flat, rhythmic, and mechanical sequence of alphanumeric codes, read aloud by a woman whose tone was completely calm, measured, and devoid of any human inflection. She was speaking in English, her cadence perfectly synchronized with a low-frequency seismic vibration that was registering on our station's microseismometers at exactly 3 Hz. Borehole 14. Core segment empty. The seal has been compromised, initiating the thermal equalization. Before I could contact the drilling superintendent on the main deck to command an emergency release of the cable assembly, my secondary monitor cleared itself of the stratigraphy software. The corporate user interface vanished, replaced by a raw monochrome system console that began compiling lines of encrypted text at an impossible speed. The data wasn't technical software code or geological records. It was an exhaustive, chronological log of structural failures, equipment losses, and personnel fatalities that had occurred at Station Boreas since the day the first shaft was sunk in 2018. The final entry on the list was dated with the current calendar day, and it displayed my own full name, my operational specialty, and the exact real-time coordinates of my telemetry shack. The station intercom on the wall next to my desk crackled to life, the speaker emitting a sharp, distorted burst of high-voltage static that made me jump. It was the voice of Jonathan, the chief drill engineer on the main deck. His voice was completely stripped of its usual professional composure, replaced by a raw, breathless panic that vibrated through the small room. He told me to look at the real-time closed-circuit television feed from the primary blowout preventer at the mouth of the borehole. I pulled up the camera feed on my third monitor, adjusting the digital contrast to cut through the freezing steam and the shadows of the lower platform. The area around the borehole should have been a chaotic zone of mud, water, and steel cables, battered by the high-pressure recovery systems. Instead, the entire drilling deck had fallen perfectly still, the boiling water inside the recovery tanks freezing solid in a matter of seconds, despite the heating elements running at full capacity. But the true horror was the material emerging from the hole. Illuminated by the high-intensity yellow floodlights attached to the cavern ceiling, the drill cable wasn't moving upward or downward. It was suspended perfectly rigid in the center of the frame, covered in a thick, rapidly growing layer of a vibrant, iridescent violet ice crystallization that looked like raw amethyst mixed with organic tissue. The material wasn't static. It was pulsing subtly, expanding and contracting in perfect synchronization with the 3 Hz seismic vibration that was shaking the entire foundation of the station. Suddenly, the mechanical rig deck above me erupted into a chaotic sequence of structural failures. The massive automated hoisting system, the heavy machinery used to lift miles of steel pipe out of the deep canyon, began to operate on its own logic. The heavy steel cables shrieked as the electric motors began to spin in reverse, forcing the drill string back down into the vacuum at a terrifying, uncommanded speed. The primary diesel generators powering the station's life support systems roared to life, their exhaust systems spewing thick clouds of white vapor into the freezing cavern as the computers forced the machinery beyond its structural redline. I ran out of the telemetry shack, stepping onto the metal safety catwalk as the freezing air hit my face. The cavern temperature had dropped 50 degrees in a matter of minutes, the air so cold that it felt like razor blades entering my lungs with every breath. As I looked down toward the main drilling floor, I saw the remaining crew abandoning their stations, running frantically toward the vertical hoist capsule that led back to the surface of the continent. Through the center of the rotary table, the steel drill cable was rushing downward into the earth like a falling elevator, the metal guides exploding under the immense frictional heat. But the borehole wasn't swallowing the cable, it was releasing something else. As the violet ice crystallization emerged from the hole, it began to coat the entire structural framework of Station Boreas. The high-strength industrial steel girders, the aluminum walls of the laboratory modules, and the heavy plastic casings of the electrical conduits were instantly covered in the pulsing, iridescent frost. The material didn't just freeze the surfaces. It seemed to alter the atomic density of the metal, transforming the solid engineering components into a brittle, transparent wireframe pattern that hummed with a low-frequency electrical charge. I ran toward the vertical lift capsule, my boots slipping violently on the wet, frosted metal grating of the stairs. The station was tilting now, one of its main support columns apparently collapsing into the subglacial canyon below as the ice sheet beneath us began to shift its weight. When I reached the upper boarding platform, I looked back down into the open cavern. The industrial halogen floodlights, which had illuminated the underground fortress for years, had completely failed. The facility was plunged into an absolute, terrifying darkness, save for the intense, cold violet radiance flooding upward from the open borehole. The sudden silence was suffocating, the roar of the machinery replaced by the deep, hollow sound of millions of tons of ice shifting and settling against the concrete foundation walls. From the center of the borehole, a sound began to rise. It wasn't a mechanical noise, and it wasn't the sound of an avalanche. It was a collective, multi-layered vocal harmonic, a wall of thousands of human voices singing a flat, microtonal chord that carried no melody and no emotion. The voices weren't shouting for help, and they weren't screaming in agony. They sounded perfectly hollow, like an automated choir constructed out of old shortwave radio transmissions, their collective breath vibrating through the iron structure of the lift capsule. I looked down into the violet light of the pit. Rising through the open borehole, completely unaffected by the extreme pressure change from the deep canyon, was a structure. It looked like a massive, geometric core composed of that same pulsing violet crystal, its surface carved with millions of microscopic, shifting lines of data that resembled the command lines that had taken over my computer screens. And embedded directly inside the translucent walls of the rising core, their bodies perfectly preserved and suspended, like insects in ancient amber, were the physical remains of the missing technicians from the historical logs. I could see the frozen forms of early Antarctic explorers in thick canvas parkas, cold warrior military surveyors in olive-drab gear, and modern research scientists in orange Arctic jumpsuits. Their eyes were wide open, their mouths fixed in the expression of the microtonal chord, their static fingers pointing upward toward the surface of the continent. The core didn't strike the lift platform. The moment the top of the geometric crystal breached the rim of the borehole, the physical gravity around the station completely collapsed. I didn't fall down toward the deck. My body was lifted smoothly into the freezing air, my safety harness snapping as I was pulled upward toward the cavern ceiling. The massive, 30,000-ton research station was lifting out of its foundations alongside me, its iron support columns, its laboratory modules, and its multi-million-dollar drilling machinery breaking apart into millions of floating fragments that drifted through the violet light like industrial space debris. The transition didn't hurt. I didn't feel the sensation of freezing to death, and I didn't feel my lungs fail. My consciousness was simply pulled apart into thousands of parallel streams of data, my memories of the surface world, my family, and my name converted into digital code lines that were instantly absorbed into the shifting patterns of the rising core. When I finally opened my eyes, the subglacial cavern was gone. I was sitting perfectly upright at my desk inside the telemetry shack. The bright, artificial white light of the laboratory modules was streaming through the glass windows, casting a clean, sterile light across my monitors. The screens were bright green, showing a completely normal, stable density log for the 14,000-foot ice layer. The drill bit was operating smoothly, its penetration rate perfectly aligned with the corporate timeline. The storm had passed. The shift was over. The relief crew arrived at 7 o'clock, laughing and talking about the football game on satellite television as they took over the logging terminals. The automated data logs showed an absolutely flawless, uninterrupted night of deep core drilling without a single pressure fluctuation, structural alarm, or containment anomaly. The corporate physicians told me I had experienced an acute episode of polar tinnitus, a temporary cognitive distortion known to happen to deep core technicians who spend months isolated in underground facilities, surrounded by the constant, low-frequency vibrations of heavy industrial drilling equipment. They signed me off for a mandatory 2-month shore leave, flew me back to the mainland on the corporate transport plane, and assured me that my standing with the initiative was completely unblemished. I try to believe their diagnoses. I live in a hot, arid valley in the desert of Arizona, as far from ice, snow, and drilling rigs as the geography of the continent will allow. I live in a dry, sunny environment where the temperature never drops below freezing, avoiding air-conditioned rooms, freezers, and cold storage facilities. But 3 days ago, I went to a local convenience store to buy a bag of ice for a backyard barbecue. I brought the plastic bag back to my house, cut the top open with a knife, and poured the ice cubes into a large metal cooler on my patio. As I watched the ice cubes, they didn't melt. They have been sitting in the hot Arizona sun for 72 hours in a 90-degree environment, but the frozen cubes haven't diminished in size, they haven't produced a single drop of liquid water, and their edges remain as sharp and crisp as the moment they were manufactured. And yesterday evening, when the sun set behind the desert hills, casting long shadows across my yard, the ice inside the cooler didn't reflect the orange light of the sky. It began to glow with a brilliant, cold violet luminescence that cast a faint, geometric pattern of lines across the brick floor of my patio. And if I press my ear flat against the frozen cubes, I can hear the soft, faint, microtonal chord of thousands of hollow voices singing from deep within the crystal, listing my name and operational coordinates over and over again. The core didn't stay down there in the trench. The borehole is still open, and they are just waiting for the temperature to equalize.